I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Bonnie Lander-Johnson, who has a wonderful talk prepared on the women of the Catholic Literary Revival. So I'd just like to ask you to put your hands together to welcome her.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? If I put it here, fab. Do please come down the front, and if you're still eating, don't worry. This is a very relaxed session. It's an absolute privilege and a pleasure to gather in this iconic London church and talk about womanhood. Thank you so much to everyone who's organised it. I think it should happen every year. This is the first time I've been here, actually, since they refurbished the church upstairs. It's really, really beautiful. Last time I was here, it had this fabulous atmosphere of decay, which I also liked. But now it's very, very shiny and gorgeous. So thanks for coming, everyone. I think this is just a wonderful event. So Benedict XVI said that the only really effective apologia for Christianity comes down to two arguments: the saints that the church has produced and the art that has grown in her womb. And that's his wording. This is a remarkable acknowledgement of the teaching capacity of the arts in the church. I think we all know that the hallmark of our faith, or one of the hallmarks of our faith, is the great visual art, architecture, and music that has for centuries filled our churches. But this is primarily devotional art, right? It's there to lift our minds to God, usually in the specific context of the liturgy. But since the late 19th century, a different form of Catholic art has flourished, especially in the English language. And that's the novel and the short story. Poetry too, of course, but I'm here to talk about prose. And I think maybe this is not devotional art, but instead an artistic exploration of what it means to live as a Catholic in daily life, which might mean it's devotional art. I'm not sure. Maybe we can talk about that afterwards. So in the English language, we actually have this rich, enormous canon of Catholic writing. Novels and short stories that were written consistently throughout every decade of the last 150 years. And taken together, these books offer us the most remarkable account of what it means to be a Catholic living everyday life. So in the English-speaking world, we usually think of the Catholic literary revival. When I say the Catholic literary revival, do you know what I mean? Have people heard of this movement before? There we go. Amazing. So it's usually a term that's applied to prose especially, but literature written by Catholics, sort of for Catholics, but actually for everybody. This is a body of literature that tends to be exceptionally well received in the non-Catholic world as well. So, you know, the mark of a great work of art is that it speaks to everybody. But for a Catholic, this is, these are books you would read and identify immediately. This is a Catholic world. These are Catholic characters. And this movement flourished in the late 19th century all the way through the 20th century. It's still going on. There's great Catholic books being written now. But in this country, we tend to associate the movement with writers like G.K. Chesterton, Evelyn Waugh, and Graham Greene. I'm seeing a few people nodding. Has anybody not heard of Waugh or Greene or Chesterton? I would encourage you to get to know them. But actually, what I'm going to be introducing you to today are the many, many books that were written as part of this movement by women. In fact, the most numerous members of this literary movement were women, but their books have almost entirely been forgotten, certainly fell out of print for a long time for reasons I don't understand. So one of my publishing projects is to bring them all back into print for us all to enjoy. I've got 4 on display here, and they're for sale in the bookshop. I really would encourage you to read them all. There's 2 more coming out this year. These are not just Victorian or post-war novels. There's 2 very modern ones coming out soon. A 1980s novel written by a woman in Northern Ireland that's set in the Troubles, and also the first English translation of this fabulous conversion story by a very famous Spanish writer called Carmen Leferet. So, I'm going to give you a brief example of just how forgotten some of these women were. Josephine Ward. Anyone heard of Josephine Ward? Okay, you've heard of Newman though, right? Yeah. She was a good friend of Newman's. Newman used to come to her house all the time to talk about the main issues of the day. They were both, they visited here. These are London people. Newman used to come to catechize her children as well. She was writing in a new Catholic church that had just been emancipated. So it was a newly legal church, we might say, in England. And she had a really strong sense that Catholics had to come together and talk like this. I mean, she used to run days like this to get Catholics together, but also non-Catholics, to talk about all of the main issues of the day from the point of view of faith. She used to give lectures, which was unusual for a woman at her time. She had 5 children, and she wrote 10 amazing novels. All of them were really well received, both in the literary world and in the Catholic world, but these are explicitly Catholic novels about Catholic families, faced with the kinds of dilemmas that we all face when we're in an essentially secular and modern society. So she almost entirely fell from the historical record. She had no entry in any of the national biographies. She has one now because we wrote one for her, and I saw recently that she has a Wikipedia entry, so she's fully arrived in the modern world. Now, many of these women writers were, in a theological and in a literary sense, actually very different. They wrote very different work to War and Green. War and Green tended to focus on male characters, a priest or a layman, in a sort of spiritual battle with the world around him, and they are fabulous stories as well. But these Catholic women tend to set their novels in the institutional places where the writers themselves, first encountered the faith. So a lot of stories about parish life, domestic life, but also schools, convents, lots of great convent novels, and convent schools. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about Caryll Houselander, who I think you may know from The Reed of God. She writes all this fabulous spiritual prose. The Reed of God is a beautiful meditation on Marian spirituality. So Houselander was a Londoner. She lived in the first half of the 20th century. She was a mystic, a visionary, a writer, and an artist as well. She wrote copious volumes of spiritual literature, both prose and verse, and she was for many years Sheed and Ward's highest-selling author. Today, she's mainly known for The Reed of God or her beautiful meditation on the Stations of the Cross. But then, near the end of her life, she wrote one novel called The Dry Wood, which is for sale here today. And then this book fell out of print in the 1960s and stayed out of print until very recently. This is what Houselander said about the creative process in The Reed of God. She wrote, "The great tragedy that has resulted from modern methods of industry is that the creativeness of Advent has been left out of work. Production no longer means a man making something that he has conceived in his own heart. No man should ever make anything except in the spirit in which a woman bears a child, in the spirit in which Christ was formed in Mary's womb, in the love with which God created the world. The integral goodness and fittingness of the work of a man's hands is sacred." So by the end of her life, Houselander decided that she wasn't going to write spiritual prose anymore, even though this is what she was most famous for. She said that instead, she didn't want to preach, this is her words, she didn't want to preach to her fellow people, her fellow Catholics in particular. She said, "I prefer writing fiction. It's more like a big gesture of sympathy, like taking hold of another sinner's hand and pressing it lovingly as we walk together." I want to think about this for a little moment. Fiction creates a person, the character, through which both the writer and the reader can encounter the faith as it appears in everyday life. Fiction allows us to ask questions that are often more difficult to ask when we're thinking theologically or philosophically. For instance, many of the stories that these women wrote ask if perhaps suffering, poverty, and pain might in some ways be good for us. And that's not really an easy question to direct philosophically at a real suffering person to whom we ought to offer solace and kindness, not moralizing. But in fiction, suffering can be shown both as an experience that we as readers can identify with and can feel empathy with, But we can also follow the character as she walks through the subsequent events and feelings in her life and see that the suffering has borne some fruit there. See that she's found insight or found consolation for and through the pain that life gives us. So I'll tell you a little bit about this book, The Dry Wood. It's set in a post-war East London Docklands parish. It's very recognisable. It follows a number of different members of the parish, from the Archbishop himself, who is a Docklander, down to the parish priest, lay people, both observant and barely observant, and then a lot of non-Catholics that live on the fringes of parish life. Now, each of these characters is given their own chapter, so we have a sort of close psychological study of each of them, and many of them actually never collide with each other. But we see their stories drawn together by the prayers and the liturgies of the parish, and by two main narrative events. One is the death of their beloved parish priest, who they all mourn, and who they believe is saintly. And the other is their love for a vulnerable child in the parish called Willie Jewell. So Willie's born very weak, and he's never thrived or spoken, but his gentleness in the face of his suffering fills the parishioners with love for him, a really spontaneous kind of love. They all gather as they pass his house in the afternoons to leave him gifts. And this love brings conversion to them all in very unexpected ways. But then, near the beginning of the novel, Willie begins to really sicken and is thought to be dying. And so these two narrative events come together. The parishioners decide that they're going to pray a novena. I mean, who's ever had a novel with a novena as the main core event? This is just wonderful. So they're going to pray a novena to their beloved parish priest for the miraculous preservation of Willie's life. And I'm not going to tell you what happens because I don't want to spoil it, but the whole energy of the novel is anticipating whether we're going to get proof that the priest is a saint and whether or not Willie will live. So I'm going to read to you now. I want to read to you from the chapter in which we first meet Martha and Art Jewell. They're the parents of Willie Jewell. To others, the most apparent thing about Willie Jewell was his weakness. He had no power in his back or limbs, and as he grew, he had to be propped up to sit. He never learnt to talk coherently, and he had tragic little helpless hands. Art saw in him the astonishing power, the tenacity of life itself. He was born at what is perhaps the most depressing hour for onlookers in any hospital, 6:30 on a winter evening, a time when the perpetually hungry nurses were all thinking with emotion of the beetroot and cold sausages for dinner. The white, shiny walls, the faint smell of anaesthetic, the hard uniform light of the electric light bulbs, all took away from any feeling of romance in this stupendous thing, a new life coming into the world. Art was aware of his complete unimportance when, as the father, he was told to sit on a bench in the passage and wait. The nurses passing up and down did not even glance at him, except for one who several times brought him a form to fill out. He had no idea what was on these forms, and he was too nervous to read them, but he put whatever the nurses told him to put, and then he signed them. On some of these visits, the nurse said, "Oh, we won't be too long now, Mr. Jewell," as if she's talking to herself, and Art was surprised that she knew his name. Then suddenly he became the centre of attention and tragically important. The nurse hurried towards him and he stood up, feeling sure it was over and that he was a father, though he'd had none of the feelings which other fathers had warned him about. Some had declared that they themselves suffered the pains of childbirth, or at least a mystical toothache. All went through agonies of suspense, but so far Art had only felt foolish. He held out his hand, expecting another form. Surely he had to fill in a form saying that a child had been born to him. But no, to his amazement, the nurse took his outstretched hand and led him to a room where Dr. Moncrief was waiting for him. "Good evening, Mr. Jewell," he said. "I have very bad news for you." "It's dead," said Art dully. "No, but we have to choose between saving the child's life or your wife's." Your wife is very exhausted and she wishes to see you before you give your decision. Will you come with me, please? Martha didn't look exhausted to Art. Her cheeks were deep pink, like rambler roses, and her eyes burned. She seized Art's hand, and he noticed that hers was very hot, with the texture of a withered leaf, and felt quite unfamiliar. He heard Martha's voice, as unfamiliar as the touch of her hand, like the voice of a stranger. She said, "Choose the child, Art." Sorry, I always actually get really upset when I try and read this one aloud. "You've got to. The church says so." The whole thing seemed quite unreal. Art turned to the doctor. "The child," he said, and he felt as if he was being strangled. His whole being was crying out, "Martha, save Martha." The nurse and the doctor glanced at one another. In their view, they'd been told to murder a woman. They felt utter contempt for the weak thing who'd given the order. "That's religion for you," Dr. Moncrief whispered to the nurse. And then he looked up and saw Martha Jewell's burning eyes fixed on him. He never forgot those eyes, like black stars that scorched his soul. The doctor fought for that infant, and he fought for the woman with the terrible flame in her eyes, and she fought for herself. Art, too, was fighting at last. Martha lived. But when at last Willie was born, Dr. Moncrief hoped that he would die and hinted that it would be a mercy. This was not within Art's hearing, but there was one terrible moment in which he thought that there was an unspoken agreement between them to let the child die. People had told him of such things. They'd put Art's misshapen infant into his hands to hold, and he felt sure that they would not have done it if they meant for him to live. It was only for a moment, however, and then the nurse took him. That was a black, agonized moment for Art Jewell. In it, something fierce and primitive awoke in him. He desired his son's life as a thirsting man desires water. Art watched the first physical struggle for survival in that tiny creature. He saw it twitch and try in vain to thrust with its powerless clenched fists. He saw it wrestling visibly for a breath, a heartbeat, a world, a life, an immortal destiny, an eternal heaven, the vision of God, and it won. The child suffered, and a new experience came to Art, an experience that grew in him all through the years of Willie's life. He saw his own eyes looking at him from the face of his dumb child, not with reproach for his life, but with love. He saw in those eyes the terrifying joy of innocence crucified. And Art Jewell, being made in the image and likeness of God, learnt something of the secret of the eternal Father when his only son looked at him from the cross. Okay, so there's really, really difficult questions at play in this scene about the role of life-giving, about the ethics and challenges of being open to life. I think many people here will recognize in this scene the principle of double effect, which is the philosophical formula or solution, we might say, or program of thought that Catholics can refer to if they're in a situation like this where two lives are in conflict with each other. But how much more human do these questions arrive in us when we encounter them in the lives of others, depicted here through characters rather than in doctrinal statements? We all must live doctrine in the tangled and fraught decisions of our mundane lives. That's actually where doctrine lives. We need the clarity of the church's teachings, but that teaching really doesn't mean anything unless it's clothed in the flesh and hearts of all of us. Okay. I want to introduce you now to a woman called Enid Dinis. Has anyone heard of Enid Dinis? She's another Londoner. She actually belonged to what was a hidden order. They're still around. Hidden orders flourished in France during the Revolution when it was necessary to be hidden. But then they became popular in London in the 19th century, often because the members of the order were related or were converts from Anglicanism and they didn't want to cause problems for their family, perhaps. So these women would join religious houses in the usual way. They would take all the usual vows, but they dressed in secular clothes. And they lived together in a house, and they taught or worked in orphanages or were nurses. And often their family members didn't actually know that they were nuns until they died. Of course, in the 20th century, it was common for single women to live together, so it didn't seem unusual. We think that Dinas joined one of these hidden orders because her father was a prominent Anglican clergyman here in London, and she didn't want to make things tricky for him. But also, I think because she was an amazing writer, she wanted to move around London a little less prominently than you would be in a pre-Vatican II habit. It's a very prominent dress. But also she was very active in the literary world, and I think she probably wanted to go to literary salons and be in that world again without this prominence. We don't know why she chose, but she did choose to live in this house in Wimbledon, and she died the abbess of the house. She wrote copious collections of these beautiful short stories that she called God's Fairy Tales. So they're little stories that explore the life of ordinary Catholic Londoners, but they translate the fairy tale form so that the magical moment that we would expect in a fairy tale is instead a miracle. So there's a kind of Catholicizing of the fairy form. And in this way, she's able to explore doctrines that are actually really difficult, quite sophisticated, difficult doctrines, but she conveys them in a way that is both mysterious, there's a wonder to them, but also very accessible. And these are stories that are all about the ordinary Londoners that she loved. Her characters are often very poor or very young, the forgotten, the sick, and each of these characters act as sources of divine grace for each other. So I want to introduce you to one story called The Girl Who Smiled Back. It's set in a London parish, so we can all picture it upstairs in St. Patrick's. So this is a pre-Vatican II parish that had processions, sacrament Eucharistic processions, kind of routine, regularly, not every Sunday, but on feast days. And the processions were organized by the nuns in the parish, and they involved the children, but only the children who knew how to dress well, walk with dignity, keep the modesty of the eyes, not to look up, these were very well-behaved children. And then the main character is this girl called Imelda, who's a very distracted child, like one of my youngest child, always dirty, clothes are always ripped, and she's always thought to be unfit for this procession, but she has this wonderful, ardent faith, and she really wants to process, and she keeps asking the nuns, please let me, and eventually they relent on the condition that she walks between her two older sisters, Claire and Teresa, who can keep her under control. I know all is going well on this procession until she's passing down the central aisle of the church and she sees a woman in a wheelchair and she finds her so arresting, like an angel, which the story suggests she might actually be. And Imelda looks up from the procession and stares openly at the woman, who stares back at her. And instead of chiding her or looking disapproving of Imelda for staring around when she should be looking down, the woman in the chair smiles back at Imelda, and Imelda smiles back at the woman, and they gaze at each other and have this wonderful exchange. But this moment delays Imelda's movement, and the children behind crash into her, causing exactly the havoc that everybody expected she would cause. Now, afterwards, Imelda chastises herself terribly, and I'll read you now. Imelda went home grieved in spirit. Sunday dinner was shorn of all its joys by a conscience pain that took away her appetite. Her sisters had carried home the terrible story of her behaviour in looking about her and tumbling over Jane Smith. At afternoon catechism, however, she received some consolation. The father told them how our Lord sometimes appeared to the saints in the Blessed Sacrament in the form of a little child. Imelda swung her feet about in sheer joy at the idea that came to her. She proposed it afterwards to Claire and Teresa on their way home. Do you think, she asked, that Jesus could have been a little child in the procession this morning? Claire and Teresa thought that it was possible. Imelda drew a quick breath. A very little child? She asked. Claire and Teresa thought maybe because the priest had called Jesus a babe, then perhaps, Imelda said, he looked at the lady in the chair too when he was being carried past her. Claire was too shocked to reply. But Teresa had a didactic mind. She said he wouldn't need to look. God can see everything without looking about him. He could see the lady in the chair if he wanted to without looking up at her. Imelda was only partly comforted. It had been so good to walk in the procession, and she'd tried so hard, so very hard to behave. For weeks, Imelda looked in vain for the lady in the chair. The lady's face haunted her. She dreamt of her at night and made up stories about her all the daytime. She somehow felt that the lady was a friend of hers, although they'd only once smiled across at each other, and at the wrong time too. She was sure the lady was a princess, or maybe a saint. Only if she were a saint, why had she not kept her eyes down in church? It was very perplexing. So then when the next procession comes along, everyone says Imelda can't do it, and Imelda begs with them. She promises Our Lady and all of the nuns that she won't look up, she'll behave herself. But then, so she's allowed to go in it. And then when the procession starts, of course, she sees the lady in the chair again, and she's filled with a desire to look up and see her angelic face. I'm going to read again. When they were actually passing the place where the chair stood, the temptation became excruciating. It was the biggest thing that Imelda had ever undergone. In the violence of the momentary struggle, she suddenly thought of the little Christ, who could see everything without looking up. And she remembered how the nuns had told her that little children should try and be exactly like Jesus Christ. She said a prayer. She said, "Little Jesus, make me exactly like you." She prayed it against the temptation to look up, but then she added with frankness, "Jesus, make me like you so that I can see the lady without looking up." The intensity of her prayer brought Imelda to a complete and sudden standstill. The girl behind gave her a sharp poke. Claire and Teresa seized her hands and dragged her on, but the procession was disorganized for at least 3 seconds. It was exactly like Imelda. She stumbled on, dazed and benumbed. Later, Imelda goes and kneels at the altar rail to beg forgiveness for messing up the dignity of the procession. But there she sees the woman in the chair, only she doesn't recognize her at first because she's out of her chair, and she's kneeling at the altar rail beside Imelda. The lady says, "You're the little girl who smiled back at me last time. You weren't in the procession today. I looked for you." I was there with my sisters among the big ones." "Ah," the lady said, "well, I saw them, but can you tell me who the little boy was who was walking between them? He was a darling little boy in a white tunic with thick golden locks. He smiled at me just like you did last time, and he turned around, and he kept smiling all the time that he passed." Then the lady stood up and said, "You know, a wonderful thing has happened. I walked here from my chair, and I haven't walked for 18 months. The doctor said that I should never walk again. I told my nurse to come and fetch me in an hour's time, but I think I'm going to walk home." "Oh," Imelda said, "Our Lady must have cured you. Or perhaps the little boy you saw was our Lord, only he wouldn't have looked about him or smiled back from the procession." The lady looked at Imelda with those kind eyes and said, "I don't know about that." Okay. Yeah, there's some real tearjerkers in there too. So Dinnis's godly fairy tales, I think they really work to retrain the modern reader to be sort of wonder-stricken by life and the church and the world and all of the people that we encounter every day. So her stories, I think often the temptation with a fairy tale might be to be sort of nostalgic, or the assumption might be that they're a kind of saccharine desire for a comforting faith, but these stories really aren't like this at all. Instead, I think they offer us a very impassioned sense that there is more to human life than modernity allows, and that even Catholics need to relearn to see God's presence in the world. I think if it is a distinctive mark of the modern world to be disenchanted, then the point of Dinnis's stories is to re-enchant through a willingness to be open to some of the radical propositions contained in Catholic doctrine. Okay. So I opened with a quote from Benedict. I'm going to finish with one from Francis, and then we can talk. In his apostolic letter on the importance of literature, Francis urged everyone, especially the clergy, to read fiction. so that they can hear the voices of others and therefore better understand them. He wrote, "The affinity between priest and poet shines forth in the mysterious and indissoluble sacramental union between the divine word and our human words, giving rise to a ministry that becomes a service both of listening and compassion." When we read Catholic literature, when we write it, maybe there's some writers in the room, we aren't just helping to imagine the faith as it's lived in everyday life and everyday feelings. We're also actually participating, in Francis's words, we're participating in a sacramental form of relationship with each other. Okay, I'm going to finish there.
So I just read Graham Greene's The End of the Affair recently and was really struck by how real it was, especially living and working in London. These are like streets and places you recognise and where he's having encounters with the other characters. And I was saying to a friend, it was almost so real that that's what really drew me into it. And she sort of made a comment about it's almost so real, it's like he couldn't make it up. Part of it was his lived experience, or sort of reflecting on how the author's experience, and a lot of these authors converted to Catholicism, how that came through in their works. So I was wondering if there are any similarities there with the female writers, or if their fiction is informed by their lived experience, and what we can learn maybe about those writers in that era that they lived in through their work, and maybe the conditions that led to the flourishing of this revival.
Yeah, a lot of them were converts. And at the end of the 19th century, when the church was opened again, as it were, that was a moment that attracted a lot of artists. I think we can forget sometimes too that the pre-Vatican II, not just the liturgy, but the sort of the prayer life of most lay people was very different to what we know, and that seems to have been attractive to artists. It was very different to walk into a Catholic church then from an Anglican one, and that seems to have drawn a lot of people in. So it was actually a very Catholic time for artists of all sorts. In most of these women, so Josephine Ward is unique in being she wasn't just born a Catholic, she actually comes from a long line of recusants. And this first book of hers is set in a recusant family on the brink of modernity, when the younger generation don't want to live cloistered away anymore because they don't have to anymore. So they're going up to London and going to parties, and there's they're facing real temptations and having to navigate that. So from Ward we get this sort of more timeless experience of English Catholicism, but basically all of the other modern ones are converts. And each of them expresses that in a different way. I would say, too, all of these women had some quite remarkable suffering in their lives, a lot of baby loss, mental breakdown, divorce or abandonment. Alice Thomas Ellis lost both a baby and then her 19-year-old son as well. Alice Thomas Ellis, another Londoner. We haven't got one of her books because it's having trouble getting the rights. But she wrote some fabulous novels. I wouldn't say hers are very Catholic, but if you are a Catholic reader, you can recognise what's going on. But she was a very devout Londoner. And definitely with her, she was already writing, and then her son died, and all of a sudden the writing went from being good to great. So there is definitely something in personal pain that inflects the artist's voice in I would say, a mystical way that helps them to create the artwork. For the rest of us, is some kind of gift that transmutes suffering into something beautiful. And a lot of those experiences are in the novel. So the novel that Alice Thomas Ellis wrote after the child died is about a grieving mother. And so she uses that experience directly. And she had to write the novel to stay sane with her grief. So for her, it was a consolation, but it produced this amazing experience for the rest of us to enter into. So all converts, and all really underwent a lot. Sheila K. Smith is an interesting example. She wrote The End of the House of Allard. This is like the end of the aristocracy, but she did it 20 years before Evelyn Waugh did it, and it's set, she was a bestseller. She wrote like 50 of these amazing agricultural novels set in rural Sussex. And she was a high church Anglican. And then when she converted, actually, unlike the others, she stopped writing because she'd already been a phenomenally successful writer. She wrote one very Catholic novel, which is this one, and then she realized she needed to open a parish because she lived in an area of Sussex where there was no parish for 9 miles or more. So she opened a parish on her farmland and became a kind of assistant to the local Catholic community. She wrote Saints' Lives, so she did write, but she kind of drifted away from fiction. So that's the only example of someone who ceased to engage in fiction. For most of them, fiction was the final point that they came to, the kind of, I mean, I think, you know, novels are the best form. And they came to it through conversion, but also through personal pain. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for this talk. It's amazing. I am in the process of just finishing up for the second time Kristin Lavransdottir by Sigrid Undset.
Oh, yeah. She's, really good.
Most amazing. I don't know if anybody's read it one time, but you read it once. When you read it the second time, you have to read it with people because it's quite...
You mean out loud?
No. You know,
in
reading
a book club
it,
style?
And,
yeah.
And because what I found really... I've never had this experience with any other novel that I've read. There were times where Undset is so brilliant at holding up a mirror to yourself. And sometimes the image that is reflected back on you is so painful that you feel like I can't go on. And yet then you have other women who are reading it with you who kind of go, we can get you through this section. And what I find fascinating about this second read-through is this phenomena has happened to all of us.
Yeah. At different points, though?
At different points.
Yeah.
One being my godmother, who is 90 years old, still practicing psychologist and brilliant woman. And she was reading it and was struck by seeing herself in what Kristin had done when she was 19 or 20 years old, that she had also done. And she had seen this pain that she had caused her family. And it was through that she said God healed her. It was something that was deep down inside that she hadn't realized. And yet, this character of Kristin, who is like a living person. There's even a statue of her in Gudbrandsdal in Norway. She's so real to them.
Yeah.
So, and sadly, I'm telling you this in terms of publishing, it's very difficult to find Kristin Lavransdottir. Now.
Oh, I thought they were all in translation in American presses.
But here it's a bit difficult. So that's
Amazon?
Yeah, but I don't like going through Amazon.
Oh, well. So, sometimes it's the only way.
Sorry.
These are only available. They're on the Waterstones book website and Amazon.
Okay,
sadly.
no, I work for a vintage and used books shop, independent bookstore. So
no, but if it's an American press, then sometimes the only way we have is Amazon.
Yeah, but no, exactly, and that's how I passed mine out. But that's something to think about. She's an amazing, and there are several other of her stories, certainly about the saints, Saint Halvard, and that have not been translated.
Yeah, I just wanted to think a bit about what you said in terms of the character being that real. I think in fiction, the characters can have the secrets. We see that, walking around the world in our normal everyday lives, we really don't reveal much to each other, even to our loved ones. Our pasts hover somewhere deep in the back of our souls or minds. We don't wear those little minor things that openly. We're too busy. We're in the present. We're not back in the past. But fiction has to build the depth of character, and often we see in the character those private, secret, or forgotten things. And it is like what you described is an act of grace that's coming to us via the story, from the writer or from whatever mystical thing God does in a writer's mind, and it's very powerful. I can't think of another vehicle quite like it. I often have an argument with my colleague who we write the introductions together. She's a theologian, and I'm often tempted to talk about the character as the person, and she says you can't, it's not a person, it's made up. But the whole point to me is that they are a person. And they are often very real to us. And, people build statues, people hold characters in their hearts all their lives. So, thank you. Yeah, hi. Just watch the time.
Monica Dickens.
Okay, I'm writing
Yes,
this down.
granddaughter of. I was introduced to her because of her very, very funny books about being a nurse, One Pair of Feet, and about being a maid in the 1930s, One Pair of Hands. But her novels are wonderful and funny.
She's an Englishwoman.
Yes, granddaughter of,
Yeah.
as I said. She's shrewd and funny, a very shrewd observer of people. But in a couple of her novels, I'm thinking of The Happy Prisoner, which is life seen through the eyes of a chap badly wounded in the Second World War and slowly recovering in his home, being looked after by his family. She is just so funny, and yet there's a conversion story in that.
Did she convert?
No, she was clearly brought up as a Catholic because in her own descriptions of her girlhood, she describes going to Smelly Angels in Bayswater, and she uses that title. She is funny about the church, and yet she also reveals, even in her very amusing descriptions of being a nurse in wartime London, a very strong moral sense. Pomposity, bitchiness is wrong, but she does this in a funny way.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that you end up, without her having bragged at all about actually quite difficult nursing in wartime England, but with a very strong sense of it was a job worth doing, and you meet all sorts of people, including ghastly ones who think they're very good.
Yeah.
I do recommend her, but she was a Catholic, and I don't know what the background story is. At some point, somebody in the Dickens family
in the second
converted.
generation, then converted and raised them.
Monica Dickens, but
I'll
she's
have a
also
look, thank
very
you.
funny, and I think this is something Catholics are good at too.
People
life
often
is
say
funny.
that women aren't funny, and most of these novels have moments that are, hilarious. I mean, Houselanders. There are moments in her novel that are so profound, you're weeping, but she's really, really, really funny, especially parish life. She's in the Mass, she does the Mass, and all the characters in the church, the woman, all the characters that we're used to seeing in parish life who are idiosyncratic and doing their own thing, the organist who wears feathers in her hair, and, these are wonderful, funny, but profound depictions of the kind of thing that we take for granted as belonging to normal Catholic life, but would never imagine to see elevated to the fictional form. But wonderful sense of humour, I think, it's really important. Thank you.